You're listening to Dead Strange, the podcast where I'll be delving into bizarre cases from across the globe. I am your host, Sophie Ray. Today's episode features the tragic case of Rebecca Coriam. For several decades, the cruise ship industry has seen growing popularity, not only with holidaymakers, but with career-driven young adults seeking a job with the promise of security and a generous paycheck. Anyone who has been on one of these massive ships will tell you that the crew devote every minute of their time to ensure each and every passenger is well looked after. As you travel smoothly towards exotic destinations, it's easy to forget that you are aboard a massive floating city in the middle of the ocean, and you feel safe and secure surrounded by luxury. Despite the industry's undeniable role in the spread of COVID-19 this year, cruise holidays are generally safe and have always remained popular since the very first commercial cruise liner was launched on June 29, 1900. In 2018, well before the damages of this global pandemic, over 27 million of us took a cruise holiday. To accommodate such a massive demand, cruise vessels house huge teams of highly trained professionals who are expected to give a consistently perfect service. These workers all come from a variety of different backgrounds and nationalities, and on the particularly busy ships, it almost seems like the whole workforce is one big family. After all, cruise liners aren't just ships, they contain almost every facility you could think of. The majority even have their own morgues, jails and hospital units, so there is rarely a need for them to stop their long journeys if the worst should happen. However, if we delve further beneath these layers of world-class leisure and splendour, we can find a shady underbelly that people rarely seem to talk about. Aside from the fact that drug trafficking offences through the use of cruise ships have become rife in recent years, there comes a much darker fact. Since 2000, nearly 300 people have gone overboard from cruise ships and ferries, according to data collected by Ross Klein, a professor in the School of Social Work at Memorial University in Newfoundland. Professor Klein also estimates that most of these missing passengers are individuals who are working on the ship, and most of them are presumed to have gone overboard. A large portion of these tragic incidences have eyewitnesses or legible CCTV footage that shows the events unfold. These cases are the ones that can be resolved, to some extent at least, as there's always someone or something to tell investigators exactly what happened. Sadly, a lot of these people are not found. In fact, only around 10% of them are ever recovered. An even scary aspect is that a legal loophole means cruise lines are not legally required to make cases of missing passengers public knowledge. So the likelihood of that number being a lot higher is a frightening possibility. If you were on a cruise ship and a man overboard signal was raised, it would usually consist of the phrase Oscar bellowed repeatedly over the tannoy system. From there, staff are trained to distract any concerned passengers and maintain a calm atmosphere. However, with so many people on board, it's possible that some missing people go unnoticed until it's too late. It's estimated that only around 15 to 20% of such cases are documented, let alone ever reported by the media. At a reach, you could even make the accusation that many cruise lines are more concerned about being tarnished with the bad publicity than the safety of their passengers and crew. One of the many people who make up this horrifying statistic is Rebecca Coriam. Rebecca, known to her family and friends as Bex, was a 24-year-old cruise ship worker from Chester, England. Rebecca showed an enormous amount of aptitude for working on a cruise ship. For instance, she was physically active, outgoing, confident, and keen to snatch up any exciting new opportunities. She had completed 2 degrees in youth studies and sports science at 2 different universities. Liverpool Hope Uni and Plymouth were proud to call Rebecca their alumni, and she was no stranger to hard work and dedication. She showed this after she graduated from her youth studies degree. She spent 4 months working at Camp America in the US state of Maine, and working closely with young people seemed to be something she thoroughly enjoyed. Before working on a cruise ship, she'd gone down the armed forces route, joining the Army cadets in her teenage years, and even volunteering for them at various events. From there, a young Rebecca went on to work at the iconic Chester Zoo, like so many of her family members had before her. The zoo holds a special place in the hearts of the Coriams, and Rebecca's grandparents even have their very own memorial bench located on the zoo's massive grounds. After working at the zoo for some time, Rebecca decided she needed a career change. In June 2010, Rebecca made the 189-mile trip to London, where she attended a job interview process for Disney Cruises. When she passed with flying colours, Rebecca was overjoyed. Out of hundreds of candidates, Rebecca's bright personality had stood out the most, and she was delighted to take on this exciting new career. Like a moth to a flame, the fast-paced life of a cruise ship worker attracted her instantly. She was told she would be working on the Disney Wonder cruise ship as a children's entertainer and guardian. The Wonder is an extremely popular vessel based in the port of Los Angeles. As is company policy, she was sent for a 4 months intensive training course at the Disney theme park in Florida. Ask any cruise ship worker and they'll tell you that the training course is intense and draining, and safety is the company's #1 priority. The ship's various safety policies are drilled into your head as soon as you step into the classroom and carry on until you leave. Nevertheless, Rebecca made short work of her training and passed every assessment, and was now an official crew member of the Wonder. Once she started at a new job, she seemed to be thriving. She'd spend 4 months working on the ship before returning for a 2-month holiday, and she'd use this free time to catch up with her friends, go shopping and keep active, things she loved to do. When away from home, back on the ship, she would keep in regular contact with her family using Facebook and Skype, and she seemed to be in a good mood in the days leading up to her disappearance. On the night of March 21st, 2011, Rebecca sent a message to her mum saying she'd call her in the morning. However, she never did. 12 hours went by and Rebecca's family grew more and more worried. At the time, the ship was travelling from Los Angeles to Puerto Vallarta in Mexico. Coriam was last seen on surveillance footage on March 22nd, 2011, at around 5:45 a.m. On the video, she's seen pacing up and down in the crew lounge, talking on one of the ship's internal phone lines, tugging at her hair and looking around frantically. Her distress is so visible that at one point a concerned crew member stops and asks her if she's okay. On tape, she appears to dismiss this crew member, whose identity remains a mystery, and they walk away and leave her. She then puts her head in her hands and appears to sob. Oddly, she's wearing men's clothing that hangs on her body loosely, much too big for Rebecca's slight frame. She abruptly hangs up the phone and walks away. A couple of grainy images are the last sighting we have of Rebecca alive. The next day, Rebecca didn't show up for a 9 a.m. shift. Knowing her absence was really unusual, her colleagues decided to search the ship, but their efforts were in vain. After all, it'd been over 3 hours since Rebecca was last seen by anyone, and there was no sign of her. Her cabin was empty and she hadn't changed into her work clothes. Eventually, her colleagues alerted the Coast Guard as well as the Mexican Navy, who conducted a widespread search of the ocean. No trace of Rebecca was found. This controversial case is the only one tied to Disney, and it stirred up so much controversy because they are suspected of either covering up the incident or acting in a way that was so incompetent that Rebecca could have been found if the correct procedures were carried out in the first place. Typically, cruise ships don't usually turn around if somebody is suspected of going overboard, but in this case the order was given to do so. For whatever reason, the captain of the Wonder refused and carried on. Perhaps he thought it was too late. It was also revealed that both the Coast Guard and Navy were given incorrect coordinates, meaning they searched the wrong part of the ocean. Furthermore, it seems odd that Disney hired their own private detective to investigate the case, a detective who only interviewed 6 staff members and ignored the ship's 2,000 plus passengers. It's unclear whether or not he interviewed the crew member who found Rebecca visibly upset on the morning of her disappearance, but you'd hope the investigator would be competent enough to do so. However, he really wasn't. For a start, no forensics were carried out, and he only spent one short day aboard the ship investigating. In her cabin, various items of Rebecca's clothing was found. They were torn and stained with an unknown substance and appeared to be thrown on the bed as if Rebecca had changed in a hurry. Could this explain why she was wearing loose-fitting clothing on those CCTV images? Shockingly, this lone investigator did not seize the clothes as evidence, meaning no forensics were carried out. Her laptop, also in her cabin, was not seized either, something you'd think the investigator would see as a crucial clue in unlocking the mystery of Rebecca's final moments. When her devastated parents were flown out to America via a private jet, they instantly became suspicious of the company, and Rebecca Coriam even said that the whole thing seemed staged, and that Disney were trying to cover up the incident to avoid bad publicity. The car's windows were fully blacked out, all courtesy of Disney, and the driver even told them that they would get, quote, the full Disney experience, unquote. A statement that seems extremely callous in retrospect. Arriving at the ship, Mike and Rebecca Coriam were hurried on board via a discreet side door, where they met with the ship's captain, who bluntly explained to them that it was likely Rebecca had been swept off a deck by a large wave. He showed them surveillance footage of their daughter and led them to her cabin, which contained a sandal reportedly belonging to Rebecca found on the deck. Now, the sandal in question was the wrong size for Rebecca and had another person's name and cabin number written inside it, meaning that it was unlikely to have even belonged to her. It was later revealed that, surprise surprise, no forensics were carried out on the shoe, perhaps one of the only shreds of physical evidence found at the supposed scene. Mortified, her parents went home, now left with more questions than answers about their missing daughter. So what are the theories surrounding this frustrating case? For a start, a lot of Disney's claims don't make any sense. For instance, the part of the deck where Rebecca was supposedly swept off was surrounded by 6-foot walls, with a swimming pool blocking anybody from getting anywhere near them. Forensic experts have determined that the supposed rogue wave would have needed to be at least 100 feet high to sweep someone off a 6-foot wall. In addition to this, stormy weather was not reported on that day. Investigating the case further was journalist John Ronson. He raised the theory that Rebecca slipped and fell off deck 4, a deck that had a jogging track where Rebecca liked to go for early morning jogs. The railings on deck 4 are much lower than on deck 5, meaning that this could be entirely plausible. However, many crew members dispute this as being completely untrue and claim that Rebecca had definitely fallen from the deck where the sandal was found. A colleague who had spoken to Rebecca at 11 PM the previous night told Ronson that she didn't believe she jumped. She believes that Rebecca went out to the pool, one of her favourite places on the ship, to be alone and relax for a while. While there, she may have climbed up and sat on the wall, feeling the cool sea breeze in her hair. Then she might have slipped and fallen, given the fact there's evidence she was intoxicated before she went missing, but we'll get into that later. The crew member then went on to finish their claim with, quote, Bex was known to be a bit of a risk taker, unquote. Later on in the case, a former Scotland Yard detective hired by Rebecca's family discovered that security footage had been strategically cropped so that the timestamp and date were hidden. Why would someone do this? Since the footage was viewed, raw copies of it have been denied to Rebecca's family and it doesn't appear anywhere in the internet. In October 2011, several months after Rebecca's disappearance, John Ronson investigated further, and he sailed aboard the Wonder ship in an attempt to make sense of the incident. After talking with many crew members, he uncovered suspicious and even sinister intentions behind Disney's explanation of the Coriam case. One crew member disclosed, quote, "Disney knows exactly what happened. That phone call she had, it was taped. Everything here is taped. There's CCTV everywhere, and they have the tape," unquote. When asked about Rebecca, another crew member replied to Ronson's inquiry by saying, quote, "I don't know anything about it. It didn't happen. You know that's the answer I have to give," unquote. As the case was investigated further, a copy of police interview notes emerged that adds a disturbing prospect to the case. After investigating, it was revealed that Rebecca had a girlfriend, Tracy Medley, both engaged in relations with another male crew member on the night she disappeared. The crew member in question was Devon Hyde, and he was once Tracy's long-term boyfriend. When he returned from leave, only to continue his relationship with Tracy, Rebecca was devastated. She had developed strong, intense feelings for Tracy after the two met at a house party, but was frustrated at Tracy's lack of serious commitment. A few hours before she went missing, Tracy claims that the three of them were partying, and Rebecca claimed she was going for a walk and would pick up more alcohol on the way back. For whatever reason, Tracy asked her, quote, "You are coming back, right?" unquote. To which Rebecca nodded. Was Rebecca Coriam visibly upset at this point? And more importantly, why? That was the last time her girlfriend saw her. In an interview, Tracy states that, quote, "In the 2 weeks before she died, she was so depressed," unquote. The relationship between Tracy and Rebecca seemed far from smooth. According to fellow colleagues on the ship, Rebecca was said to be in an extremely passionate relationship with Tracy and became visibly uncomfortable when Devon Hyde was introduced into the mix. Nevertheless, she agreed to a threesome with Devon and Tracy on the night she disappeared. The head of security, who has remained anonymous since their interview with the media, perhaps described Rebecca's tricky predicament perfectly in a statement. They stated that, quote, "Rebecca was very, very uncomfortable with it, but she did it anyway. I think it was her first time sleeping with a man," unquote. In spite of this, according to a statement made by Tracy, Rebecca was the one who initiated the threesome in the first place, but without her side of the story, it's difficult to view this as a solid fact. Considering the threesome happened just hours before she vanished, we could perhaps assume that Rebecca was coerced in one way or another, perhaps into an open relationship she really didn't want to commit to. The statement from the head of security is extremely disturbing for a number of reasons. For one, it appears that they know a lot more about Rebecca Coriam's personal life than they should. True, they could have been a close friend of Rebecca's or Tracy's, but the comments they made seem very out of place and a little suspicious, especially considering the professionalism needed in their job role. As head of security, it seems bizarre that they would even comment on the situation, especially a situation of such tragic and unknown circumstances. Another odd thing about their statement is that it's entirely possible Rebecca was calling the security team that night on the phone. When you dial an emergency number on a ship so far out at sea, for example 911 or 999, it either doesn't work or goes straight to the ship's security office, providing you are not close to any phone masts on the coastline. We know that Rebecca's call didn't go to any emergency operator on dry land because the case would have been reported a lot sooner, or at least there would be a record of it. It's unknown who she was calling exactly, and this is perhaps one of the most frustrating aspects of this case. If the person on the other end of the phone came forward, then it's likely we'd have a lot more concrete ideas on what happened. If she was speaking to the security office, she could have been explaining her situation to them, perhaps how she felt upset or guilty. After all, Rebecca was raised Catholic, in a largely conservative setting. Engaging in those acts on that night could have triggered her into extreme emotional turmoil. For now, we will never know the truth about that fateful call. In the police notes, the superintendent investigating remarks how when questioned, Devon Hyde had a, quote, very disturbing, almost nonchalant attitude, unquote, despite the seriousness of the situation. The Coriam family and their supporters strongly suspect their daughter was murdered because she wouldn't agree to an open bisexual relationship with Devon and Tracy, while many others believe she jumped to her death. However, suicide seems like an extreme measure for what appears to be a minor situation or grievance. Her parents also strongly dispute the theory of suicide, because when they visited her quarters after the incident, they found 2 passes for Disneyland Paris, which Rebecca was planning on giving to her sister as a surprise. It seems bizarre that she would book a holiday with her sister, only to make the decision to end her life so abruptly. It's worth noting, though, that people very rarely plan their suicide. Sometimes ideation takes over following emotional trauma or distress, and mental illness can manifest itself out of nowhere, leading somebody on a downward spiral into deep depression. As of October 2020, almost a decade on from this tragic case, nobody is being charged in connection to Rebecca Coriam's disappearance. Frustrated with the company, her parents decided to take legal action against Disney in 2014, with claims that the company had failed in its duty of care. A spokesperson for Disney claimed that there was no merit in the legal action when her parents attempted to sue the company for $75,000. In their case, they questioned why the alarm had been raised 4 hours after she didn't show up for her 9 AM shift. They also accused Disney Cruise Lines of acting negligently regarding their lack of urgency. For example, they waited a total of 7 hours to phone for the police in the Bahamas. 7 long hours where Rebecca could have been recovered from the relentless swell of the Atlantic Ocean. Later on in the case, and 2 years after their first court appearance, the family settled a deal with Disney for an undisclosed amount of money, with the help of their Miami-based attorney Jim Walker. Walker simply stated that the case had been resolved in a quick interview outside the courtroom, and that he was unable to talk about it any further. Since then, it's understood that the Coriams are pursuing a further legal case back in the UK. Whether or not that case turns over any crucial answers remains unknown. British MP Chris Matheson strongly believes that Rebecca may have been murdered, and was so invested in this unusual case that he even joined forces with an unnamed former police investigator to try and find more information about the night Rebecca vanished. Together, they attempted to probe Disney for some well-deserved answers. Sadly, they were met with secretive dead ends and a general shortage of crucial information. Although her family and friends strongly believe she was murdered, her girlfriend Tracy has a completely different view. In 2017, she broke her silence and finally agreed to be interviewed by the media. She claims that the Rebecca she knew was far from the happy person her family painted her out to be. Instead, she says Rebecca was in constant emotional turmoil after being the victim of assault as a teenager, and that she used cocaine to cope with her problems. She claims that Rebecca had confided to her that she felt like a misfit, and that her family were ashamed of her for being gay. Growing up gay in a Catholic household was undoubtedly hard for Rebecca. It's unknown whether or not she had discussed her lifestyle with her parents, as Mike and Anne-Maria have never talked about the matter publicly. In her interview, Tracy said, quote, "I have nothing to hide. My silence was never an admission of guilt. My silence was to protect the image of a friend. I've spent 6 years reading claims from Rebecca's family that she was this fun-loving, never-sad athlete with no issues and a love for life. To them, Rebecca's disappearance could not possibly be due to suicide, and they were looking for someone to blame," unquote. Talking about the incident further, Tracy explained, quote, "The night she went missing, I remember her being really upset. She started drinking, and while we tried to walk her back to her room, She screamed, cried, punched herself in the face, and banged her head against the walls of the ship. It took 4 people to calm her down. Later that night, Rebecca woke me up and said something along the lines of feeling like a failure because she wasn't brave enough to jump off the ship, unquote. Now residing in Boston, Tracy has since married and has a young daughter. She claims that she never did anything to physically harm Rebecca, and that her gut tells her Rebecca jumped to her death. Whether or not Tracy's account of that night is entirely true cannot be determined. However, her claims that Rebecca was suicidal are extremely telling, and could perhaps shed some light onto Rebecca's final moments. It's also worth noting the fact that Rebecca's grandfather, Thomas Jennings, passed away in June 2010. Rebecca was said to be extremely close to her grandfather, and the grief that still lingered could have affected her tremendously during her final moments. With little support from the company that once employed her family and friends grew more and more frustrated. In a stark contrast to the American entertainment giant Disney, UK officials stated that they were contemplating opening a formal inquiry and described the original investigation as appalling and disrespectful. These government officials, alongside Rebecca's friends, family, and the family members of other victims who have gone missing from cruise ships, openly criticised Disney. They all agreed that huge companies such as Disney and many other cruise ship operators were far more interested in avoiding bad publicity related to these incidents than anything else. While this claim may seem bold, it's entirely justified. In each and every one of these cases, the grieving families have criticised these companies for their lack of investigation and suspected cover-up, all in the name of reputation. Bill Anderson, a maritime investigation coordinator, worked closely with the grieving Coriam family. He stated that, quote, "I am fully convinced that an assault took place and that the crew members were all aware of it," unquote. Her family have set up a website dedicated to Rebecca in the hopes of receiving tips from anyone who has critical information on her. Whatever the truth, we are still left with tons of unanswered questions about Rebecca's fate, with her family desperately searching for some much needed closure. That's it for the first ever episode of Dead Strange. I'd like to give a special thanks to Emily G. Thompson from the Morbidology podcast for helping me out so much along the way. And to anyone who's decided to tune into this episode, thank you so much, and I hope you'll stick around for next week. I have been your host, Sophie Ray. Bye for now.